Fedwin Moore died of poison, I fear, but I have no idea who gave it to him." To her surprise, Carlton merely shook his head with a rueful grimace and muttered something incomprehensible about wine. As for the others, they became warders of their own free will. Her Roshan certainly had not wanted to be a warder until she decided she wanted him for one. Even a woman who was not Aes Sedai could usually make a man decide the way she wanted. They thought it a better choice, safer, than returning to the others like you. You see, the damage here was done with Saidin. You understand who must have been behind it. It was an attempt to kill the one whose sanity you fear for. That did not seem to surprise him either. What sort of men were these Ashaman? Was their so-called Black Tower a murder pit? The tightness went out of his arm, though, and suddenly he was just a road-weary young man who needed to shave. "Light," he breathed. "What do we do now, Loyal? Where do we go?" "I don't know," Loyal replied, his shoulders sagging tiredly and his long ears drooping. We have to find him, Carlton. Somehow. We can't give up now. We have to let him know we did what he asked, as much as we could." And what was it Althor had asked, Samitsu wondered. With a little luck, she could learn a great deal from these two. A tired man, or Ogier, feeling lost and alone, was ripe for answering questions. Carlton gave a small jump, his hand tightening on his sword hilt, and she bit back a curse of her own as a palace serving woman came running into the room with her skirts gathered almost to her knees. "Lord Dobrain's been murdered!" the serving woman squealed. "We will all be killed in our beds. My own eyes have seen the dead walking old Marangil himself, and my man says spirits will kill you if there has been a murder done. They—" Her mouth froze open when she caught the presence of Aes Sedai, and she skidded to a halt, still clutching her skirts. The kitchen folk seemed frozen too, all watching the Aes Sedai from the corners of their eyes to see what they would do. "Not Dobrain," Loyal moaned, ears laying flat against his head. "Not him." He looked as much angry as saddened, his face stony. Samitsu did not think she had ever seen an Ogier angry. "What is your name?" Sashal demanded of the serving woman, before Samitsu could even part her lips. "How do you know he was murdered? How do you even know he's dead?" The woman swallowed, her eyes held by Sashal's cool gaze. "Sarah, Aes Sedai," she said hesitantly, bending her knees in a curtsy and only then realizing that she still had her skirts gathered up. Hastily smoothing them down only seemed to fluster her more. "Sarah Doinal? They say... Everybody says Lord Dobrain is... I mean, he was... I mean..." She swallowed again, hard. "They all say his rooms are covered with blood. He was found lying in a great pool of it. His head cut off, they say." "They say a great many things," Sashal said grimly, "and usually they're wrong. Samitsu, you will come with me. If Lord Dobrain has been injured, you may be able to do something for him. Loyal, Carlton, you come too. I don't want you out of my sight before I have a chance to ask a few questions." "Burn your questions," the young Ashaman growled, shouldering his belongings. "I'm leaving." "No, Carlton," Loyal said gently, laying a huge hand on his companion's shoulder. "We can't go before we know about Dobrain. He's a friend, Rand's friend, and mine. We can't. Anyway, where are we hurrying to?" Carlton looked away. He had no answer. Samitsu squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath, but there was no help for it. She found herself following Sashal out of the kitchens, once more hurrying to keep up with the other woman's quick, gliding stride. In fact, she found herself half running. Sashal set an even more rapid pace than before. The babbling of voices rose behind them as soon as they were out the door. The kitchen folk probably all were pressing the serving woman for particulars,
details she very likely would invent where her knowledge failed. 10 different versions of events would find their way out of that kitchen, if not as many as there were kitchen folk. Worst of all, 10 different versions of events in the kitchen would find their way out, everyone adding to the rumors Corgaida doubtless was already starting. She could hardly recall a day that had gone so badly for her so suddenly, like slipping on one patch of ice only to find another under her feet, then another. Cadswain would have her hide to make gloves after this. At least Loyal and Carlton trailed after Sachal as well. Whatever she learned from them might still be put to advantage, a way to salvage something. Scurrying along at Sachal's side, she studied them in brief glances over her shoulder. Taking short strides to keep from overrunning the Aes Sedai, the Ogier was frowning in worry. Over Dobrain, very likely, but also perhaps over only completing his mysterious task as well as he could. That was a mystery she intended to solve. The young Ashaman had no difficulty keeping up, though he wore an expression of stubborn reluctance and his hand caressed his sword hilt. The danger in him did not lie in steel. He stared suspiciously at the backs of the Aes Sedai ahead, once meeting Samitsu's glance with a dark glower. He had the sense to keep his mouth shut, though. She would have to find a way to pry it open later for more than snarling. Sachal never glanced behind to make sure the pair were following, but then she had to hear the thud of the Ogier's boots on the floor tiles. Her face was thoughtful, and Samitsu would have given a great deal to know what she was thinking. Sachal might be oath-sworn to Randall Thor, but what protection did that give to an Ashaman? She was red, after all. That had not changed with her face. Light. This could be the worst patch of ice of all. It was a long, arduous climb from the kitchens to Lord Dobrain's apartments in the Tower of the Full Moon, which was usually set aside for visiting nobility of high rank. And all along the way, Samitsu saw the evidence that Sarah had been far from the first to hear what the ever-anonymous they had to say. Rather than endless streams of servants flowing along the corridors, small, excited knots stood whispering anxiously. At sight of the Aes Sedai, they sprang apart and scurried away. A handful did gape at seeing an Ogier striding through the palace, yet for the most part they all but fled. The nobles who had been about before had all vanished, doubtless back to their own rooms, to mull over what opportunities and hazards Dobrain's death afforded them. Whatever Sachal thought, Samitsu no longer doubted. If Dobrain had been alive, his own servants would have put paid to the rumor already. For further confirmation, the hallway outside Dobrain's rooms was crowded with ashen-faced servants, their sleeves ringed to the elbows in the blue and white of House Taborwin. Some wept, and others looked lost, their foundation stone pulled out from under them. At a word from Sachal, they stood aside for the Aes Sedai, moving drunkenly or mechanically. Dazed eyes swept by the Ogier without actually registering what they saw. Few remembered to make even half-hearted curtsies. Inside, the anteroom was almost as full of Dobrain's servants, most staring as if poleaxed. Dobrain himself lay motionless on a litter in the middle of the large room, his head still attached to his body, but his eyes closed, and a drying sheet of blood from a long cut in his scalp across his still features. A dark trickle had leaked from his slack mouth. Two serving men with tears streaming down their cheeks paused in the act of laying a white cloth over his face at the entrance of the Aes Sedai. Dobrain did not appear to be breathing, and there were blood-stained gashes in the chest of his coat, with its thin stripes of color that marched down to his knees. Beside the litter, a dark blot larger than a man's body marred the green and yellow Tyran maze of the fringed carpet. Anyone who lost that much blood had to be dead. Two other men lay sprawled on the floor, one with death-glazed eyes gazing at the ceiling, the other on his side, an ivory knife hilt sticking up from his ribs where the blade had surely reached his heart. Short, pale-skinned Kyrianan, both wore the livery of palace servants, but a servant never carried the long wooden-handled dagger that lay beside each corpse. A House Tabor-Wynn man, his foot drawn back to kick one of the corpses, hesitated on seeing the two sisters, then planted his boot hard in the dead man's ribs anyway. Clearly, proper decorum lay far from anyone's mind at the moment. "Move that cloth out of the way," Sashal told the men by the litter. "Samitsu, see whether you can still help Lord Dobrain." Whatever she believed, instinct had moved Samitsu toward Dobrain, but that command, it was clearly a command, put a stutter in her step. Gritting her teeth, she kept moving, and knelt carefully beside the litter, on the side away from the still damp slot, to put her hands on Dobrain's blood-soaked head. She never minded getting blood on her hands, but bloodstains were impossible to get out of silk unless you channeled, and she still felt a pang of guilt at the waist when she used the power for something so mundane. The necessary weaves were second nature to her, so much so that she embraced the source and delved the Kyrianan lord without thought, and blinked in surprise. Instinct had made her go ahead, though she had been certain there were 3 corpses in the room, yet life still flickered in Dobrain. A tiny, guttering flame that the shock of healing might well extinguish. The shock of the healing she knew. Iz searched out the pale-haired Ashaman. He was crouched beside one of the dead servants, calmly searching the man, oblivious of the shocked stares of the living servants. One of the women suddenly noticed Loyal standing just inside the door, and goggled as if he had leapt out of thin air. With his arms folded across his chest and a grim expression on his broad face, the Ogier looked as though he were standing.
Life powers? He paused for a moment, frowning at her. Flynn, I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't have much talent for healing anyway. Eyeing Dobrain, he added, He looks dead to me, but I hope you can save him. He was at the wells. And he bent back to rummaging through the dead servant's coat. Samitsu licked her lips. The thrill of being filled with Saidar always seemed diminished to her in situations like this. Situations when all of her possible choices were bad. Carefully she gathered flows of air, spirit, and water, weaving them just so, the basic weave of healing that every sister knew. No one in living memory had the talent for healing as strongly as she, and most sisters were limited in what they could heal, some to little more than bruises. By herself, she could heal almost as well as a linked circle. Most sisters could not regulate the weave to any degree at all. Most did not even try to learn. She had been able to from the start. Oh, she could not heal one particular thing and leave everything else as it was, the way Dahmer could. What she did would affect everything from the stab wounds to the stuffed nose Dobrain was also suffering from. Delving had told her everything that ailed him. But she could wash away the worst injuries as if they had never been, or heal so whoever she healed appeared to have spent days recovering on her own, or anything in between. Each took no less of her strength, but they did require less from the patient. The smaller the amount of change in the body, the smaller the amount of the body's strength it drained. Only, except for the gash in his scalp, Dobrain's wounds were all serious. 4 deep punctures in his lungs, 2 of them gashing the heart as well. The strongest healing would kill him before his wounds finished closing, while the weakest would revive him long enough to drown in his own blood. She had to choose somewhere in the middle and hope that she was right. I am the best that ever has been, she thought firmly. Cadswain had told her that. I am the best. Altering the weave slightly, she let it sink into the motionless man. Some of the servants cried out in alarm as Dobrain's body convulsed. He half sat up, deep-set eyes opening wide, long enough for what sounded all too much like a long death rattle to rush out of his mouth. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he slipped from her grasp, thudding back down onto the litter. Hastily she readjusted the weave and delved him again, holding her breath. He lived. By a hair, and so weak he might yet die, but it would not be those stabs that killed him, except indirectly. Even through the drying blood that matted his hair, shaven away from his forehead, she could see the puckered pink line of a fresh, tender scar across his scalp. He would have the same beneath his coat, and he might be troubled by shortness of breath when he exerted himself, if he pulled through. Yet for the moment he did live, and that was all that mattered. For the moment. There was still the matter of who had wanted him dead, and why. Releasing the power, she stood unsteadily. Saidar draining out of her always made her feel tired. One of the serving men, gaping, hesitantly handed her the cloth he had been going to lay on his lord's face, and she used it to wipe her hands. "Take him to his bed," she said. "Get as much mild honey water down him as you can. He needs to gain strength quickly. And find a wise woman. A reader? Yes, a reader. He will need her, too." He was out of her hands now, and herbs might help. At least they were unlikely to harm, coming from a reader, and at worst the woman would make sure they gave him enough honey water and not too much. With much bowing and many murmurs of thanks, 4 of the serving men took up the litter and carried Dobrain deeper into the apartments. Most of the other servants followed hurriedly, wearing expressions of relief, and the rest dashed out into the corridor. An instant later, glad shouts and cheers broke out, and she heard her name nearly as often as Dobrain's. Very gratifying. It would have been more satisfying if Sashal had not smiled and given her an approving nod. Approving? And why not a pat on the head while she was about it? Carlden had paid no mind at all to the healing, insofar as Samitsu had noticed. Finishing his search of the second corpse, he rose and crossed the room to Loyal, attempting to show the Ogier something, shielded by his body, without letting the Aes Sedai notice. Loyal plucked it, a sheet of cream-colored paper, creased from folding, out of the Ashaman's hand and held it up in front of his face, opened out in his thick fingers, ignoring Carlden's scowl.
"But this makes no sense,"
the Ogier muttered, frowning as he read.
"No sense at all. Unless—"
He cut off abruptly, long ears flickering, and exchanged a tense look with the pale-haired fellow, who gave a curt nod.
"Oh, this is very bad,"
Loyal said.
"If there were more than 2, Carlden, if they found—"
He choked off his words again at a frantic headshake from the young man. "I will see that, please," Sashal said, holding out her hand, and please or no please, it was not a request. Carlden attempted to snatch the paper from Loyal's hand, but the Ogier calmly handed it to Sashal, who inspected it without any change of expression, then handed it to Samitsu. It was thick paper, smooth and expensive, and new-looking. Samitsu had to control her eyebrows' desire to climb as she read. "At my command, the bearers of this are to remove certain items which they will know from my apartments and take them out of the Sun Palace. Make them private of my rooms, give them whatever aid they require, and keep silent on this matter in the name of the Dragon Reborn and on pain of his displeasure. Dobrain Taborwin." She had seen Dobrain's writing often enough to recognize the rounded hand as his. "Obviously, someone employs a very good forger," she said, earning a quick, contemptuous glance from Sashal. "It did seem unlikely he wrote it himself and was stabbed by his own men in mistake," the Red said in cutting tones. Her gaze swung to Loyal and the Ashaman. "What is it they might have found?" she demanded. "What is it you are afraid they found?" Carlton stared back at her blandly.
"I just meant whatever they were looking for,"
Loyal answered.
"They had to be here to steal something."
But his tufted ears twitched so hard they almost vibrated before he could master them. Most Ogier made very poor liars, at least while young. Sashal's ringlets swung as she shook her head deliberately. "What you know is important. The pair of you are not leaving until hour 2. And how are you going to stop us?" The very quietness of Carlton's words made them more dangerous. He met Sashal's gaze levelly, as if he had not a worry in the world. "Oh, yes, very much a wolf, not a fox." "I thought I'd never find you," Rosara Medrano announced, marching into that moment of perilous silence, still wearing her red gloves and fur-lined cloak, with the hood thrown back to reveal the carved ivory combs in her black hair. There were damp patches on the shoulders of the cloak from melted snow. A tall woman, as brown as a sun-dark Aiel, she had gone out at first light to try finding spices for some sort of fish stew from her native tier. She spared only the briefest glance for Loyal and Carlton, and did not waste a moment inquiring after Dobrain. "A party of sisters has entered the city, Samitsu. I rode like a madwoman to get here ahead of them, but they could be riding in at this moment. There are Ashaman with them, and one of the Ashaman is Loghain." Carlton barked a rough laugh, and suddenly Samitsu wondered whether she was going to live long enough for Cadsuane to have her hide.
Chapter 1. Time to be gone. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long...
Oh, my other speaker's dead now. Give me 1 second, everyone.
Bluetooth mode.
Wind rose in the Rannon Hills. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time. But it was a beginning. Among the groves and vineyards that covered much of the rugged hills, the olive trees and evergreen rose, the ordered vines leafless till spring, the cold wind blew west and north across the prosperous farms dotting the land between the hills and the great harbor of Ebudar. The land lay winter fallow still, but men and women were already oiling plowshares and tending harnesses, preparing for the planting to come. They paid little mind to the trains of heavily laden wagons moving east along the dirt roads, carrying people who wore odd clothes and spoke with odd accents. Many of the strangers seemed to be farmers themselves, familiar implements lashed to their wagon boxes, and in their wagons unfamiliar saplings with roots balled in rough cloth, but they were heading on toward more distant land, nothing to do with life here and now. The Shonshan hand lay lightly on those who did not contest Shonshan rule, and the farmers of the Rannon Hills had seen no changes in their lives. For them, rain or the lack of it had always been the true ruler. East and north the wind blew, across the broad blue-green expanse of the harbor, where hundreds of huge ships sat rocking at anchor on choppy swells, some bluff-bowed and rigged with ribbed sails, others long and sharp-prowed, with men laboring to match their sails and rigging to those of the wider vessels. Not nearly so many ships still floated there as had only a few days before, though. Many now lay in the shallows, charred wrecks, heeled over on their sides, and burned frames settling in the deep gray mud like blackened skeletons. Smaller craft skittered about the harbor, slanting under triangular sails or crawling on oars like many-legged water bugs, most carrying workers and supplies to the ships that still floated. Other small vessels and barges rode tethered to what appeared to be tree trunks shorn of branches rising out of the blue-green water. And from those, men dove holding stones to carry them down swiftly to sunken ships below, where they tied ropes to whatever could be hauled up for salvage. 6 nights ago, death had walked across the water here, the one power killing men and women in ships in darkness split by silver lightnings and hurtling balls of fires. Now the rough rolling harbor, filled with furious activity, seemed at peace by comparison, the chop giving up spray to the wind that blew north and west across the mouth of the river Eldar, where it widened into the harbor, north and west and inland. Sitting cross-legged atop a boulder covered with brown moss on the reed-fringed bank of the river, Matt hunched his shoulders against the wind and cursed silently. There's no gold to be found here, no women or dancing, no fun. Plenty of discomfort, though. In short, it was the last sort of place he would choose normally. The sun stood barely its own height above the horizon. The sky overhead was pale slate gray, and purple clouds moving in from the sea threatened rain. Winter hardly seemed winter without snow. He had yet to see a single flake in Abu Dar. But a cold, damp morning wind off the water could serve as well as snow to chill a man to the bone. 6 nights since he had ridden out of the city in a storm, that his throbbing hips seemed to think he was still soaked to the skin and clinging to a saddle. This was no weather or time of day for a man to be out by his own choice. He wished he had thought to bring a cloak. He wished he had stayed in bed. Ripples in the land hid Abu Dar, just over a mile to the south, and hid him from the city as well, but there was not a tree or anything more than scrub brush in sight. Being in the open this way made him feel as though ants were crawling under his skin. He should be safe, though. His plain brown woolen coat and cap were nothing like the clothes he was known by in the city. Instead of black silk, a drab woolen scarf hid the scar around his neck, and the collar of his coat was turned up to hide that as well. Not a bit of lace or a thread of embroidery, dull enough for a farmer milking cows. No one he needed to avoid would know him to recognize, if they saw him, not unless they were close. Just the same, he tugged the cap a bit lower. "You intend to stay out here much longer, Matt?" Noel's tattered dark blue coat had seen better days, but then so had he. Stooped and white-haired, the broken-nosed old fellow was squatting on his heels below the boulder, fishing off the riverbank with a bamboo pole. Most of his teeth were missing, and sometimes he felt at a gap with his tongue, as though surprised to find the empty space. "It's cold, in case you haven't noticed. Everybody always thinks it's warm in Abu Dar, but winter is cold everywhere, even places that make Abu Dar feel like Shinar. My bones crave a fire, or a blanket anyway. A man can be snug with a blanket if he's out of the wind. Are you going to do anything but stare downriver?" When Matt only glanced at him, Noel shrugged and went back to peering at the tarred wooden float bobbing among the sparse reeds. Now and then he worked one gnarled hand as though his crooked fingers felt the chill particularly, but if so, it was his own fault. The old fool had gone wading in the shallows to scoop up minnows for bait with a basket that now sat half submerged and anchored by a smooth stone at the edge of the water. Despite his complaints about the weather, Noel had come along to the river without urging or invitation. From things he had said, everyone he cared about was long years dead, and the truth of it was he seemed almost desperate for any sort of company. Desperate indeed to choose Matt's company when he could be 5 days from Abu Dar by now. A man could cover a lot of ground in 5 days if he had reason to and a good horse. Matt had thought on that very subject often enough himself. The far side of the Eldar, half hidden by one of the marshy islands that dotted the river, a broad-beamed rowboat backed oars, and one of the crew stood up and fished in the reeds with a long boat hook. Another oarsman helped him heave what he had caught into the boat. At this distance, it looked like a large sack. Matt winced and shifted his eyes downriver. They were still finding bodies, and he was responsible. The innocent died along with the guilty, and if you did nothing, then only the innocent died. Or as bad died. Maybe worse than, depending on how you looked at it. Scowled irritably. Blood and ashes, he was turning into a bloody philosopher. Taking responsibility drained all the joy out of life and dried a man to dust. What he wanted right then was a great deal of mulled wine in a snug common room full of music and plump, pretty serving maid on his knee, somewhere far from Abu Dar. Very far. What he had were obligations he could not walk away from, and a future he did not fancy. There seemed no help at all in being Taviran, not if this was how the pattern shaped itself to you. He still had his luck, anyway. At least he was alive and not chained in a cell. Under the circumstances, that counted as luck. From his perch, he had a fairly clear view down past the last low, marshy river islands. Wind-caught spray drifted up the harbor like banks of fine mist, but not enough to hide what he needed to see. He was attempting to do sums in his head, counting ships afloat, trying to count wrecks. He kept losing his place, though, thinking he had counted vessels twice and starting over. The sea folk who had been recaptured intruded on his thoughts, too. He had heard that gibbets in the Rahad across the harbor displayed more than 100 corpses, with placards listing murder and rebellion as their crimes. Normally, the Shanchan used the headsman's axe and the impaling stake, while the blood got the strangling cord, but property had to settle for being hanged. And me, I did what I could, he thought sourly. There was no use feeling guilty that was all he could do. Not a bit of use. None. He had to concentrate on the people who escaped. The Afan Mier who got away had taken ships in the harbor for their flight, and while they might have seized some smaller craft, anything they could board and overwhelm in the night, they had intended to carry off as many of their people as possible. With thousands of them laboring as prisoners in the Rahad, that would have meant big ships by choice, and that meant Shanchan great ships. Many of the sea folks' own vessels were large enough, for certain, but they had all been stripped of their sails and rigging by that time to be fitted out in the Shanchan fashion. If he could calculate how many great ships remained, he would have some notion of how many Afan Mier had actually reached freedom. Freeing the sea folk windfinders had been the right thing to do, the only thing he could do. But aside from the hangings, hundreds and hundreds of bodies had been fished out of the harbor in the last 5 days, and the light only knew how many had washed out to sea with the tides. The grave diggers labored from sunup to sundown, and the graveyards were filled with weeping women and children. Men, too. More than a few of those dead had been Afan Mier, with no one to weep while they were dumped into mass graves, and he wanted some idea of the number he had saved to balance his bleak suspicions of the number he had killed. Estimating how many ships had made it out into the Sea of Storms was difficult, though, quite apart from losing the count. Unlike Aes Sedai, windfinders had no strictures against using the power as a weapon, not when the safety of their people was at stake, and they would have wanted to halt pursuit before it began. No one gave chase in a burning ship. Shanchan, with their Damani, had even less compunction against fighting back. Lightning bolts lacing through the rain as numerous as blades of grass, and balls of fire streaking across the sky, some the size of horses. The harbor seemed to flame from one side to the other, till even in a storm, the night made any illuminator's show look stark. Without turning his head, he could count a dozen places where the charred ribs of a great ship stuck up out of shallow water, or a huge bluff-bowed hull lay on its side, with the harbor waves looking against the tilted deck. And twice as many where the lines of blackened timbers were finer, the remains of sea-folk rakers. Apparently, they had disliked leaving their own vessels to people who had put them in chains. 3 dozen right in front of him, that without adding in the sunken wrecks that had salvage boats working over them. Perhaps a seafarer could tell great ship from wrecker by the tops of masts sticking out of the water, but the task was beyond him. Suddenly an old memory tugged at him, of lading ships for an attack from the sea, and how many men could be crowded into how much space for how long. It was not his memory, really, from an ancient war between Fergensea and Morina. It seemed his. Realizing that he had not actually lived one of those ancient bits of other men's lives that were stuck in his head always took him a little by surprise now. So maybe they were his, in a way. They were certainly sharper than some stretches of his own life. The vessels he recalled had been smaller than most in the harbor, yet the principles were the same. They don't have enough ships, he muttered. The Shanchan had even more in Tanchico than had come here. The losses here were sufficient to make the difference. Enough ships for what? Noel said. I never saw so many in one place before. It was quite a statement coming from him. To hear Noel tell it, he had seen everything, and nearly always bigger or grander than what was in front of his nose. Back home, they would have said he kept tight purse strings on the truth. Matt shook his head. They don't have enough ships left to take them all back home. You don't have to go home, a woman drawled behind him. We've come home. He did not quite jump at the slurred Shanshan accent, but it was a near thing before he recognized who was speaking. Guinan was scowling, her eyes like blue daggers, but not for him. At least, he thought not. She was tall and lean, with a hard face that was pale-skinned despite a life at sea. Her green dress was bright enough for a tinker, or close to it, and embroidered with a mass of tiny yellow and white blossoms on the high neck and down the sleeves. A flowered scarf, tied tightly under her chin, held a long black wig on her head, spilling halfway down her back and over her shoulders. She hated the scarf and the dress, which did not quite fit, but her hands checked every other minute to make sure the wig was straight. That concerned her more than her clothes, though concern was not nearly a strong enough word. She had only sighed over cutting her long fingernails short, but she almost had a fit, red-faced and pop-eyed, when he told her she must shave her head completely. The way her hair had been cut before, shaved above her ears with only a bow-like cap and a wide shoulder-length tail on the back remaining, shouted that she was of the Shanshan blood, a lesser noble. Even someone who had never laid eyes on a Shanshan would have remembered seeing her. She had agreed, reluctantly, but afterward she was close to hysterical, until she was able to cover her scalp. Not for the reasons most women would have gone over the moon, though. No. Among the Shanshan, only the imperial family shaved their heads. Men who went bald began wearing wigs as soon as their hair started falling out to any noticeable degree. Guinan would have died before letting anyone think she was pretending to belong to the imperial family, even people who would never have had the thought in their lives. Well, that sort of pretense did carry a death penalty among the Shanshan, but he would never have believed she would go on about it so. What was one more death penalty when your neck was already being stretched for the axe? The strangling cord, in her case. The noose would be for him. Flipping the half-drawn knife back up his left sleeve, he slid down from the boulder. He landed poorly and almost fell, barely hiding a wince at the stabbing jar to his hip. He did hide it, though. She was a noblewoman and a ship captain, and she made enough tries at taking charge without him showing any more weakness to give her an opening than he had to. She had come to him for help, not the other way round, but that buttered no bread with her. Leaning against the boulder with his arms folded, he pretended he was lounging, idly kicking at tufts of dead grass to work the pain out. That was sharp enough to put sweat on his forehead despite the cold wind. Fleeing in that storm had cost him ground with his hip, and he had not made it up yet. "You sure about the sea folk?" he asked her. No point in mentioning the lack of ships again. Too many Shanshan settlers had spread out from Ebudar anyway, and apparently even more from Tanchico. However many ships they had, no power on Earth would ever root out all the Shanshan now. Reaching toward the wig again, she hesitated, frowning at her short fingernails, and instead tucked her hands under her arms. "What about them?" She knew he had been behind the Windfinder's break for freedom, but neither of them had mentioned it specifically. She always tried to avoid talking about the Afaan-Mier. Quite aside from all the sunken ships and dead, freeing Damani was another death penalty charge, and disgusting besides, in the Shanshan view, as bad as rape or molesting children. Of course, she had helped free some Damani herself, though to her way of thinking, that was among the least of her crimes. Still, she avoided that topic too. There were quite a few subjects she held silent on. "You certain about the Windfinders who were caught? I've heard talk about cutting off hands or feet." Matt swallowed a sour taste. He had seen men die, had killed men with his own hands. The light sent him mercy he had killed a woman once. Not even the darkest of those other men's memories burned so hot as that, and a few of those were dark enough to need drowning in wine when they floated to the surface. But the thought of deliberately cutting off someone's hands curdled his stomach. Aginan's head jerked, and for a moment he thought she would ignore his question. "Talk for Morena, I'll wager," she said, with a dismissive gesture. "Some Sultan talk about that nonsense to frighten recalcitrant Damani when they're new-leashed. But nobody's done it in, 600 or 700 years. Not many, anyway. And people who can't control their property without mutilation are Sai Moisief to start." Her mouth twisted in loathing, though whether for mutilation or Sai Moisief was unclear. "Shamed or not, they do it," he snapped. Sai Moisief went beyond being shamed to a Shanshan, but he doubted that anyone who deliberately cut off a woman's hand could be humiliated enough to kill themselves. Is Suroth one of that not many? The Shonchan woman glared to match his and planted her fists on her hips, leaning forward with her feet astride as though she were on the deck of a ship and about to berate a fumble-witted sailor. High Lady Suroth doesn't own these demoni, you lump-brained farmer. They're property of the Empress. May she live forever. Suroth might as well slit her own wrists straight away as order something like that for Imperial demoni. That's even if she would. I've never heard of her mistreating her own. I'll try to put this in terms you can understand. If your dog runs away, you don't maim it. You switch the dog so it knows not to do that again, and you put it back in the kennel. Besides, demoni are just too valuable, Matt finished for her dryly. He had heard that until he was sick of it. She disregarded his sarcasm, or maybe did not notice. In his experience, if a woman did not want to hear something, she could ignore it till you yourself started to doubt you had spoken. I'm finally beginning to understand, she drawled, nodding. Those demoni you're so worried about probably don't even have whelps left by this time. Her gaze went to the ships in the harbor, and slowly took on a look of loss, made deeper by the hardness of her face. Her thumbs ran across her fingertips. You wouldn't believe what my demoni cost me, she said in a quiet voice. Her, and hiring the Suldam for her. With every throne I paid, of course. Her name's Sarisa, well-trained, responsive. She'll gorge herself on honeyed nuts if you'll let her, but she never gets seasick or the sulks, the way some do. A pity I had to leave her in Cantarin. I suppose I'll never see her again. She sighed regretfully. I'm sure she misses you as much as you miss her, Noel said, flashing a gap-toothed smile, and for all the world he sounded sincere. Maybe he was. He contended that he had seen worse than demoni and Dockervale, for what that was worth. Keenan's back stiffened, and she frowned as if she did not believe his sympathy. Or else she had just realized how she was staring at the ships in the harbor. Certainly she turned away from the water very deliberately. I gave orders that no one was to leave the wagons, she said firmly. Likely crewmen on her ships had jumped at that tone. She jerked her head away from the river, as though she expected Matt and Noel to jump where she indicated too. You know, Matt grinned, showing teeth. He could manage an insolent grin that sent most puffed-up fools into apoplexy. Eginin was far from a fool, most times, but puffed up she was. Ship captain and noblewoman. He did not know which was worse. Bah, for both. I was about ready to head that way. Unless you're not done fishing, Noel. We can wait here a while if you're not. But the old man was already emptying the remaining silver-gray minnows out of his basket into the water. His hands had been broken badly, maybe more than once, by their lumpy appearance, yet they were deft in winding his line around the bamboo pole. In the short time he had been fishing, he had caught nearly a dozen fish, the largest less than a foot long, strung through the gills on a looped reed, and he moved those to the basket before picking it up. He claimed that if he could find the right peppers, he was going to make a fish stew. From Shara, of all places. As well say from the moon. A stew that would make Matt forget all about his hip. The way Noel went on about the peppers, Matt suspected any forgetting would be because he was focused on finding enough ale to cool his tongue. Eginin, waiting impatiently, was paying no attention to Matt's grin either, so he slipped an arm around her. If they were heading back, they might as well get started. She knocked his hand away from her shoulder. The woman made some maiden aunts he had known look like tavern girls. We're supposed to be lovers, you and I, he reminded her. There's nobody here to see, she growled. How many times do I have to tell you, Lylewind? That was the name she was using. She claimed it was Terabonner. At any rate, it did not sound Shonsha. If we don't hold hands unless we see somebody watching, we're going to look a pretty strange pair of lovers to anybody we don't see. Snorted in derision, yet she let him put his arm back around her and slipped hers around him. But she gave him a warning stare at the same time. Matt shook his head. She was crazy as a spring hare if she thought he enjoyed this. Most women had a little padding over their muscles, at least the women he liked, but hugging Eginin was like hugging a fence post, almost as hard and definitely as stiff. He could not puzzle out what Doman saw in her. Maybe she had not given the Ileaner any choice. She had bought the man, after all, same as buying a horse. Burn me, I'll never understand these Shonchan, he thought. Not that he wanted to. The only thing was, he had to. As they were turning away, he took one last glance back at the harbor, and almost wished he had not. Two small sailing craft broke through a wide wall of mist that was drifting slowly down the harbor, drifting against the wind. Time to be gone, and past time. It was better than 2 miles from the river to the Great North Road, across rolling countryside covered in winter-brown grasses and weeds and dotted with clumps of vine-tangled bushes, too thick to push through, even with most of the leaves gone. The rises hardly deserved the name of hill, not for anyone who had climbed in the sand hills and the mountains of mist as a boy. There were gaps in his own memories, but Mac could remember some of that. Yet before long, he was glad he had an arm around somebody. He had sat motionless on that bloody rock for too long. The throb in his hip had faded to a dull ache, but it still made him limp. And without some sort of support, he would have been staggering on the slopes. Not that he leaned on again, of course, but holding on helped steady him. The woman frowned at him, as though she thought he was trying to take advantage. "If you did as you were told," she growled, "I wouldn't need to carry you." He showed his teeth again, this time not trying to disguise it as a smile. The way Noel scampered along beside them easily, never missing a step despite balancing his basket of fish on his hip with one hand and carrying his fishing pole in the other, was embarrassing. For all he looked hard-worn, the old man was spry enough, too spry by half at times. Their route slanted north of the Circuit of Heaven, with its long open-ended tiers of polished stone seats where, in warmer weather, wealthy patrons sat on cushions beneath colorful canvas awnings to watch their horses race. Now the awnings and poles were stowed away, the horses all in their country stables, those the Shonchan had not taken, and the seats were empty save for a handful of small boys darting up and down the tiers in a game of keep-away. Matt was fond of horses and racing, but his eyes slid past the circuit toward Abu Dar. Whenever he topped a rise, the city's massive white ramparts were visible, deep enough that they supported a road encircling the city on top. And looking gave him an excuse to pause a moment. Fool woman. A scrap of a limp did not mean she was carrying him. He managed to keep a good temper, take the rough with the smooth, and no complaining. Why could she not? Inside the city, white roofs and walls, white domes and spires, ringed in thin bands of color, gleamed in the gray morning light, a picture of serenity. He could not make out the gaps where buildings had burned to the ground. A long line of farmers' high-wheeled ox carts was trundling through the wide-arched gateway that opened on the Great North Road, men and women on their way to the city markets with whatever they had left to sell this late in winter, and in their midst a merchant's train of big canvas-topped wagons behind 6- and 8-horse teams, carrying goods from a light new ware. 7 more trains, ranging from 4 wagons to 10, stood in line at the side of the road to wait for the gate guards to finish their inspections. Trade never stopped entirely while the sun shone, no matter who ruled the city, unless there was actual fighting. Sometimes it
I'll
did
be
not stop
right
completely
back,
then.
everyone.
The stream of people flowing the other way was mostly Shonchan, soldiers in ordered ranks with their segmented armor painted in stripes and helmets that looked like the heads of huge insects, some marching and some mounted. Nobles who were always mounted, wearing ornate cloaks, pleated riding dresses and lace veils, or voluminous trousers and long coats. Shonchan settlers were still departing the city too, wagon upon wagon filled with farmers and craftsmen and the tools of their trades. The settlers had begun leaving as soon as they came off the ships, but it would be weeks before they were all gone. It was a peaceful scene, workaday and ordinary, if you ignored what lay behind it, yet every time they reached a place where he could see the gates, his mind flashed back to 6 nights ago, and he was there again, at those same gates. The storm had grown worse as they crossed the city from the Terracin Palace. Rain fell by buckets, pounding the darkened city and slicking the paving stones under the horses' hooves, and wind howled off the sea of storms, driving the rain like stones from slings and jerking at cloaks so that keeping it all dry was a lost cause. Clouds hid the moon, and the deluge seemed to soak up the light of the pole lanterns carried by Blerick and Fenn, on foot ahead of the rest. Then they entered the long passageway through the city wall and gained a bit of shelter, at least from the rain. The wind made the high-ceilinged tunnel keen like a flute. The gate guards were waiting just inside the far end of the passage, 4 of them, also bearing pole lanterns. A dozen more, half of them Shonchan, carried halberds that could strike at a man in the saddle, or pull him out of it. Two Shanshan with their helmets off were peering from the lighted doorway of the guardhouse built into the white plastered wall, and shifting shadows behind them told of others inside. Too many to fight past quietly, maybe too many to fight past at all, not without everything going off like an illuminator's firework bursting in his hand. Guards were not the danger anyway, not the main danger. A tall, plump-faced woman in dark blue, her divided ankle-length skirts bearing red panels worked with silver lightning bolts, stepped past the men in the guardhouse door. A long silvery metal leash was coiled in the Suldam's left hand, the free end connecting her to the graying woman in a dark gray dress who followed her out with an eager grin. Matt had known they would be there. The Shanshan had Suldam and Damani at all the gates now. There could even be another pair inside, or two. They did not mean to let one woman who could channel escape their nets. The silver fox-head medallion beneath his shirt lay cold against his chest. Not the cold that signaled someone embracing the source nearby, just the accumulated chill of the night and his flesh too icy to warm it. But he could not stop waiting for the other. Light, he was juggling fireworks tonight, with the fuses lit. Guards might have been puzzled by a noblewoman leaving Abu Dar in the middle of the night and that weather, with over a dozen servants and strings of pack horses indicating a journey of some distance. But Aginin was of the blood, her cloak embroidered in an eagle with spread black and white wings, and long fingers on her red riding gloves to accommodate her fingernails. Ordinary soldiers did not question what the blood chose to do, even the low blood. Which did not mean there were no formalities. Anyone was free to leave the city when they wished, but the Shanshan recorded the movement of the money, and 3 rode in the entourage, heads down and faces covered by the hoods of their gray cloaks, each linked to a mounted Suldam by the silvery length of an idam. The plump-faced Suldam walked by them with barely a glance, strolling down the tunnel. Her Damani peered intently at every woman they passed, though, sensing whether she could channel, and Matt held his breath when she paused beside the last mounted Damani, with a slight frown. Even with his luck, he would not bet against the Shanshan recognizing an Aes Sedai's ageless face if they looked inside that hood. There were Aes Sedai held as Damani, but what were the odds that all 3 of Aginins would be? Like what were the odds one of the low blood would own 3? Plump-faced woman made a clicking sound, as you might to a pet dog, and twitched the idam, and the Damani followed her on. They were looking for Marath Damani, trying to escape the leash, not Damani. Matt still thought he might choke. The sound of dice rolling had started up again in his head, loud enough to rival the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Something was going to go wrong. He knew it. The officer of the guards, a burly Shanshan with tilted eyes like a Saldaean, with pale honey-brown skin, bowed courteously and invited Aginin into the guardhouse to have a cup of spiced wine, while a clerk wrote down the information about the Damani. Every guardhouse Matt had ever seen was a stark place, yet the lamplight glowing in the arrow slits made this one seem almost inviting. A pitcher plant probably looked inviting to a fly, too. He had been glad of the rain dripping from the hood of his cloak and running down his face. It disguised the sweat of his nerves. He held one of his throwing knives, resting flat atop the long bundle draped in front of his saddle. With it lying flat like that, none of the soldiers should notice. He could feel the woman inside the cloth breathing under his hands, and his shoulders were knotted from waiting for her to cry out for help. Selusha kept her mount close to him, peering at him from the shelter of her hood, with her golden braid tucked out of sight, never even glancing away when the Suldam and Damani walked by. A shout from Selusha would have put the weasel in the chicken run as much as one from Tuon. He thought the threat of the knife had held both women silent. They had to believe he was desperate enough, or crazy enough to use it, but he still could not be sure. There was so much about Night he could not be sure of, so much off balance and askew. He remembered holding his breath, wondering when someone would notice that the bundle he carried was richly embroidered, and question why he was letting it get soaked with rain, wondering and cursing himself for grabbing a wall hanging because it had been close to hand. In memory, everything slowed. Aginin stepped down, tossing the reins to Doman, who took them with a bow from his saddle. Doman's hood was pushed back just enough to show that his head was shaved on one side, and his remaining hair gathered in a braid that hung to his shoulder. Raindrops dripped from the stocky Illianer's short beard, yet he managed the proper stiff-necked arrogance of a Sojin, hereditary upper servant to one of the blood, and thus almost equal to the blood. Definitely higher than any common soldier. Aginin glanced back toward Matt and his burden, but the mask of the past overture. If you did not mention it, it would do. Talent or Damani turned briskly back toward the top, finished with their inspection. Talent was behind Matt, leading one of the strings of pack horses, and as always, sitting his horse like a sack of suet, leaned from his saddle and spat. Matt did not know why that hung in his memory, but it did. Bannon spat, and trumpets sounded, thin and sharp, in the distance far behind them. From south of the city, where men had been planning to fire Shanchan supplies stored along the Bay Road. The officer of the guard hesitated at the sound of the trumpets, but suddenly a bell pealed loudly in the city itself, then another, and then it seemed hundreds were clanging alarm in the night as the black sky split with more lightning than any storm had ever birthed, silver-blue streaks stabbing down inside the walls. They bathed the tunnel in flickering light. That was when the shouting started, amid the explosions back in the city and the screaming. For a moment, Matt had cursed the Windfinders for moving sooner than he had been promised. But the dice in his head had stopped, he realized. Why? It made him want to curse all over again, but there was no time for even that. In the next instant, the officer was hurriedly urging Aginin back into her saddle and on her way, hurriedly shouting orders to the men boiling out of the guardhouse, directing one into the city at a run to see what the alarm was, while he arrayed the rest against any threat from inside or out. The plum-faced woman ran to place herself and her Damani with the soldiers, along with another pair of women linked by an idam, who came running from the guardhouse. And Matt and the others galloped out into the storm, carrying with them 3 Aes Sedai, 2 of them escaped Damani, and the kidnapped heir to the Shanchan crystal throne, while behind them a far worse storm broke over Abu Dar. Lightning bolts more numerous than blades of grass. Shiver, Matt pulled himself back to the present. Aginin scowled at him and gave him an exaggerated pull. Lovers arm in arm don't hurry, he muttered. They stroll. She sneered. Dolan had to be blinded by love. That, or he had taken too many thumps on the head. The worst was over and done, in any case. I'd hoped that getting out of the city had been the worst. He had not felt the dice since. They were always a bad sign. His back trail was as muddled as he could manage, and he was sure it would take someone as lucky as he to separate the gold from the dross. The Seekers had been on Aginin's scent before that night, and she would be wanted on charges of stealing the money now as well, but the authorities were expected to be riding as hard as she could, and already leagues from Abu Dar, not just sitting outside the city. Nothing except a coincidence of timing connected her to Tuon, or to Matt, and that was important. Tylan certainly would have leveled her own charges against him. No woman was going to forgive a man tying her up and shoving her under a bed, even when she had suggested it. Yet with any luck, he was beneath suspicion for anything else that had happened that night. With any luck, no one except Tylan had a thought for him at all. Trussing a queen like a pig for market would be enough to get a man dead usually, but it had to count for moldy onions alongside the Daughter of the Nine Moons disappearing, and what could Tylan's toy have to do with that? It still irritated him that he had been seen as a hanger-on, worse, a pet. There were advantages. He thought he was safe, from the Shanchan anyway, yet one point worried him like a thorn buried in his heel. Well, several did. Most growing out of Tuon herself, but this one had a particularly long point. Tuon's disappearance should have been as shocking as the sun vanishing at noon, but no alarm had been raised. None. No announcements of rewards or offers of ransom, no hot-eyed soldiers searching every wagon and cart within miles, galloping through the countryside to root out every cubbyhole and niche where a woman might be hidden. Those old memories told him something of hunting for kidnapped royalty, yet except for the hangings and the burned ships in the harbor, from the outside Abu Dar seemed unchanged from the day before the kidnapping. Keenan alleged that the search would be in utter secrecy, that many of the Shanchan themselves might still not know Tuon was missing. Her explanation involved the shock to the Empire and ill omens for the return, and the loss of Saiter. And she sounded as if she believed every word, but Matt refused to buy a penny's worth. The Shanchan were strange folk, but no one could be that strange. The silence of Abu Dar made his skin prickle. He felt a trap in that silence. When they reached the Great North Road, he was grateful that the city was hidden behind the low hills. The road was a broad highway, a major avenue of trade, wide enough for 5 or 6 wagons abreast uncrowded, with a surface of dirt and clay that hundreds of years of use had packed nearly as hard as the occasional ancient paving stone that stuck an edge or corner inches into the air. Matt and Aginin hurried across to the verge on the other side, with Noel dogging their heels, between a merchant's train rumbling toward the city, guarded by a scar-faced woman and 10 hard-eyed men in leather vests covered with metal discs, and a string of the settlers' oddly shaped wagons, rising to peaks at the ends, that were heading north, some pulled by horses or mules, others by oxen. Clustered between the wagons, barefoot boys used switches to herd four-horned goats with long black hair and big, dew-lapped white cows. One man at the rear of the wagons, in baggy blue breeches and a round red cap, was leading a massive humpbacked bull by a thick cord tied to a ring in its nose. Except for his clothes, he could have been from the Two Rivers. He eyed Matt and the others, walking in the same direction, as if he might speak, then shook his head and plodded on without looking at them again. Contending with Matt's limp, they were not moving fast, and the settlers forged ahead slowly but steadily. Hunched-shouldered, and the scarf beneath her chin with her free hand, Aginin let out a breath and loosened fingers that had begun to grip Matt's side almost painfully. After a moment, she straightened and glared at the farmer's departing back, as though she were ready to chase after him and box his ears and his bulls. If that were not bad enough, once the farmer was 20 or so paces away, she shifted her scowl to a company of Shan soldiers marching down the middle of the road at a pace that would soon overtake the settlers, perhaps 200 men in a column 4 abreast, followed by a motley collection of mule-drawn wagons covered with tightly lashed canvas. The middle of the road was left free for military traffic. Half a dozen well-mounted officers in thin-plumed helmets that hid all but their eyes rode at the column's head, looking neither left nor right, red cloaks spread neatly over their horses' cruppers. The banner following on the officers' heels was marked with what looked like a stylized silver arrowhead, or maybe an anchor, crossed by a long arrow and a jagged lightning bolt in gold, with script and numerals below that Matt could not make out as gusts swept the banner this way and that. The men in the supply wagons wore dark blue coats and breeches and square red and blue caps, but the soldiers were even more showy than most Shanchan. Their segmented armor, striped in blue, banded at the bottom with silvery white, and red, banded with golden yellow. Their helmets painted in all 4 colors, so they resembled the faces of fearsome spiders. A large badge with the anchor, I thought it must be an anchor, and arrow and lightning was fastened to the front of each helmet, and every man except the officers carried a double-curved bow at his side, with a bristling quiver at his belt, balancing a short sword. "Ship's archers," Aginin grumbled, glowering at the soldiers. Her free hand had left her scarf, but it was still clenched in a fist. "Tavern brawlers. They always cause problems when they're left ashore too long." They had a well-trained look to Matt. Anyway, he had never heard of soldiers who did not get in fights, especially when they were drunk or bored, and bored soldiers tended to get drunk. A corner of his mind wondered how far those bows would carry, but it was an absent thought. He wanted nothing to do with any Shanchan soldiers. If he had his way, he would have nothing to do with any soldiers ever again. But his luck never ran that far, it seemed. Fate and luck were different, unfortunately. 200 paces at most, he decided. A good crossbow would outrange them, or any Two Rivers bow. "We're not in a tavern," he said through his teeth, "and they're not brawling now. So let's not start one just because you're afraid a farmer would speak to you." Her jaw set, and she shot him a look hard enough to crack his skull. It was the truth, though. She was fearful of opening her mouth near anyone who might recognize her accent. A wise precaution in his book, but everything seemed to grate at her. "I have a bannerman over here asking questions if you keep glaring at them. Women around Abu Dhar are famous for being demure," he lied. What could she know of local customs? She gave him a sidelong frown. Maybe she was trying to figure out what demure meant. But she stopped grimacing at the archers. She just looked ready to bite instead of hit. "That fellow's dark as enough on me here," Noel muttered absently, staring at the passing soldiers. "Dark as a Sharan, but I'd swear he has blue eyes. I've seen the like before, but where?" Trying to rub his temples, he almost struck himself on the head with the bamboo fishing pole, and he took a step as though he meant to ask the fellow where he had been born. With a lurch, Matt caught the old man's sleeve. "We're going back to the show, Noel. Now. We should never have left." "I told you that," Again said with a sharp nod. Matt groaned, but there was nothing for it but to keep walking. Oh, it was way past time to be gone. He hoped he had not left it too late. Chapter 2. Two Captains. About 2 miles north of the city, a wide blue banner stretched between two tall poles rippled in the wind, proclaiming Balan Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, in brilliant red letters large enough to be read from the road, perhaps 100 paces east. For those unable to read, it at least indicated the location of something out of the ordinary. This was the largest traveling show in the world, so the banner claimed. Luca claimed a great many things, but Matt thought he must be telling the truth about that. The show's canvas wall, 10 feet high and tightly pegged at the bottom, enclosed as much ground as a good-sized village. The people streaming by looked toward the banner curiously, but the farmers and merchants had their work ahead of them, and the settlers their future, and none turned aside. Thick ropes fastened to posts set in the ground were meant to herd crowds to the wide arched entrance just behind the banner, but there was no one waiting to get in, not at this hour. Of late, few came at any hour. The fall of Abu Dar had brought only a slight drop in attendance, once people realized the city would not be looted, and they did not have to flee for their lives. But with the return, all those ships and settlers, nearly everyone decided to hold on to their coin against more pressing needs. Two bulky men, huddling in cloaks that might have come from a rag bag, were on duty beneath the banner to keep out anyone who wanted to peek around without paying, but even those were in short supply nowadays. The pair, one with a crooked nose above a thick mustache, and the other missing an eye, were squatting on the dirt, tossing. Surprisingly, Petra Anhill, the show's strong man, stood watching the two horse handlers play, arms larger than most men's legs, folded across his chest. He was shorter than Matt, but at least twice as wide, his shoulders straining the heavy blue coat his wife made him wear against the cold. Petra seemed engrossed in the dicing, but the man did not gamble, not so much as pitching pennies. He and his wife Clarine, a dog trainer, saved every coin they could spare, and Petra needed small excuse to talk at length about the inn they intended to buy one day. Even more surprising, Clarine was at his side, enveloped in a dark cloak, and apparently as absorbed in the gaming as he. Petra glanced warily over his shoulder into the camp when he saw Matt and Aginin approaching arm in arm, which made Matt frown. People looking over their shoulders was never good. Clarine's plump brown face broke into a warm smile, though. Like most women in the show, she thought he and Aginin were romantic. Bent-nosed horse handler, a heavy-shouldered tyrant named Cole, leered as he scooped up the wager, a few coppers. No one but Doman could see Aginin as pretty, but to some fools nobility bestowed beauty. Or money did. And a noblewoman must be rich. A few thought any noblewoman who abandoned her husband for the likes of Matt Coffin might be open to leaving him too, and bringing her money with her. That was the story Matt and the others had put around to explain why they were hiding from the Shanshan. A cruel husband and a lover's flight. Everyone had heard that sort of tale, from gleemen or books, if seldom real life, often enough to accept it. Cole kept his head down, though. Aginin, Lowin, had already drawn her belt knife on a sword juggler, a too handsome fellow who had been overly suggestive in asking her to share a cup of wine in his wagon, and no one doubted she would have used the blade if he had pressed his suit an inch further. As soon as Matt reached the strong man, Petra said quietly, "There are Shanshan soldiers talking to Luca, about 20 of them. The officers talking with him leastwise." He did not sound frightened, but worry creased his forehead, and he laid a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. Clarine's smile faded, and she raised one hand to rest atop his. They trusted Luca's judgment, after a fashion, yet they knew the risk they were running, or thought they did. The risk they believed in was bad enough. "What do they want?" Aginin demanded, pushing free of Matt before he could crack his teeth. In fact, no one waited for him. "Hold these for me," Noel said, handing his bowl and basket to the one-eyed man, who gaped up at him. Straightening, Noel slipped a knobbly hand beneath his coat, where he kept two long-bladed knives. "Will we reach our horses?" he asked Petra. The strong man eyed him doubtfully. Matt was not the only one unsure whether Noel still possessed all his wits. "You're not interested in searching," Clarine said hastily, making a hint of a curtsy to Aginin. Everyone was supposed to pretend Matt and the others were part of the show, but few managed to carry it off with Aginin. "The officer's been in Luca's wagon for a good half hour, but the soldiers have been standing by their horses all that time." I don't think they're here about you, Petra added respectfully. Again to Agina. Why should he be different? Probably practicing to welcome nobles to that inn. We just didn't want you to be surprised or worried seeing them. I'm sure Luca will send them off with no trouble. Despite his tone, the creases remained in his forehead. Most men became upset ran off, and a nobleman could make his strangers made it particularly easy without added complications. You don't have to worry about anybody talking out of turn, my lady. Glancing at the horse handlers, Petra added, Does she cold? Bentnose shook his head, his eyes on the dice he was bouncing on his palm. He was a big man, but not as big as Petra, and the strong man could straighten horseshoes with his bare hands. Everybody likes a chance to spit on a noble's boots now and then, the one-eyed fellow mumbled, peering into the basket of fish. He was almost as tall and wide-shouldered as Cole, but his face was all leathery wrinkles, and he had even fewer teeth than Noel. Glancing at Aginin, he ducked his head and added, Begging your pardon, lady. Besides, this was a little coin. I've done much of lately. Right, Cole? Them Sean-chan will take us home. Maybe hang us like they did them sea folk. Or put us to work cleaning them canals, the other side of the harbor. Horse handlers did whatever needed doing around the show, from mucking the horse lines and cleaning animals' cages to erecting and taking down the canvas wall. But he shuddered as though digging out silted canals in the Rahad was a worse prospect than hanging. I say anything about talking? Cole protested, spreading his hands. I just asked how long we're going to sit here, that's all. I just asked when we're going to see some of this coin. We sit here as long as I say sit. It was remarkable how hard Aginin made that drawl sound without raising her voice, like a blade sliding free of the scabbard. We see your coin when we reach our destination. There will be a little something extra for those who serve me faithfully, and a cold grave for anyone who thinks on betrayal. Cole pulled his much-patched cloak tight and widened his eyes, trying to look indignant, or maybe innocent. But he just appeared to be hoping she would come close enough for him to filch her purse. Matt ground his teeth. For one thing, that was his gold she was promising with such a free hand. She had her own, but not near enough for this. More importantly, she was trying to take charge again. Light. Except for him, she would still be in Abu Dar, scheming to avoid the Seekers, if not already being put to the question. Except for him, she would never have thought of staying close to Abu Dar to throw off pursuit, or found a hiding place with Luca's show. But why were soldiers there? The Shonchan was 1,000 for a vague suspicion of Tuon's presence. If they suspected the Aes Sedai, no. Petra and Clarine did not know they were helping hide Aes Sedai, but they would have mentioned Suldam and Damani. And the soldiers would not be hunting sisters without them. He fingered the fox head through his coat. He wore that waking and sleeping, and it might give him a little warning. He never considered trying for the horses, and not just because Cole and a dozen more like him would go running to the Shonchan before he was well out of sight. They had no particular animosity toward him or Aginin that he knew. Even Ruman, the sword juggler, seemed to have settled in happily with a contortionist named Adria, but some folks would not resist the temptation of a little more gold either. In any case, no warning dice tumbled in his head, and there were people inside those canvas walls he could not leave behind. They're not searching, then we have nothing to worry about, he said confidently. But thanks for the warning, Petra. I've never liked surprises. The strong man made a small gesture as if to say it was nothing, but Aginin and Clarine looked at Matt as though startled to find him there. Even Cole and the one-eyed lout blinked at him. It took an effort to stop short of gritting his teeth again. Just wander near Luca's wagon and see what I can see. Larwin, you and Noel find Oliver and stay with him. They liked the boy. Everyone did. And that would keep them out of his hair. He could eavesdrop better alone. And if they had to run, maybe Aginin and Noel could help get the boy out at least. The light sender did not come to that. He could see nothing but disaster in it. Well, I suppose nobody lives forever, Noel sighed, retrieving his bamboo pole and basket. Burn him, but the fellow could make a colicky goat seem cheerful. Petra's frown certainly deepened. Married men always seemed to be worried. One reason Matt was in no hurry himself. As Noel vanished around the corner of the canvas wall, the one-eyed man watched the fish go regretfully. He appeared to be another without a full set of wits. He probably had a wife somewhere. Matt pulled his cap almost down to his eyes. Still no dice. He tried not to think of how many times he had nearly had his throat slit or his skull split without any dice. But surely they would have been there if there was any real danger. Of course they would. He had not taken 3 steps inside the entrance before Aginin caught up to him and slipped her arm around his waist. He stopped in his tracks, eyeing her balefully. She resisted his orders the way a trout fought the hook, but this went beyond stubborn. What do you think you're doing? What if this Shang-Chen officer recognizes you? That seemed as likely as Tylan herself walking into the show, but anything that might make her leave was worth grabbing. Are the chances this fellow is anyone I know? She scoffed. I don't have... Her face twisted for an instant. Have many friends this side of the ocean, and none in Abu Dar. She touched an end of the black wig over her bosom. Anyway, in this, my own mother wouldn't recognize me. Her voice turned bleak toward the end. He was going to chip a tooth if he kept unclenching his jaw. Standing there arguing with her would be worse than useless, but the way she had stared at those Shang-Chen soldiers was fresh in his mind. Don't glare at anybody, he warned her. Don't even look at anybody. I'm a demure Abu Dhabi woman. She made it sound a challenge. You can do all the talking. She made that into a warning. Light. When a woman was not making everything smooth, she made things very rough indeed. And Agina never made anything smooth. He was definitely in danger of chipping a tooth. From the entrance, the show's main street meandered among wagons like those the Tinkers used. Little houses on wheels, with the wagon shafts lifted against the driver's seats, and walled tents often as large as small houses. Most of the wagons were brightly painted, every shade of red or green, yellow or blue, and many of the tents were just as colorful, a few even striped. Here and there, wooden platforms where entertainers could perform stood beside the street, their colored bunting beginning to look a bit grubby. The broad expanse of dirt, near 30 paces wide and beaten flat by thousands of feet, really was a street, one of several that wound through the show. The wind whipped away faint gray streamers of smoke rising from the tin chimneys that stuck up from the roofs of the wagons, and from some tents. Most of the show folks were likely at breakfast, if not still in bed. They rose late as a rule Matt approved, and no one would want to eat sitting around a cook fire outside in this cold. The only person he saw was Aludra. The sleeves of her dark green dress pushed up her forearms, grinding something with a bronze mortar and pestle on a table that folded down from the side of her vivid blue wagon, just around the corner on one of the narrower side streets. Intent on her work, the slender Tarabana did not see Aginin and Matt. He could not help looking at her, though. With her dark hair and thin beaded braids that hung to her waist, Aludra was probably the most exotic of Luca's marvels. He advertised her as an illuminator, and unlike many of the other performers in marvels, she really was what Luca claimed, though Luca probably did not believe it himself. Matt wondered what she was grinding, and whether it might explode. She had promised to reveal the secret of fireworks if he could answer a riddle, but he had not found a glimmer so far. He would, though, one way or another. Aginin poked a hard finger into his ribs. We're supposed to be lovers, as you keep reminding me, she growled. Who's going to believe it if you stare at that woman as though you're hungry? Matt grinned lasciviously. I always look at pretty women. Haven't you noticed? Adjusting her headscarf with a little more vigor than usual, she gave a disparaging grunt, and he was satisfied. Her prudish streak came in handy now and then. Aginin was on the run for her life, but she was still Shang-Chen, and she already knew more about him than he liked. He was not about to trust her with all of his secrets, even the ones he did not know yet. Luca's wagon sat in the very middle of the show's camp, the most favored position, as far as possible from the smells of the animal cages and horse lines situated along the canvas walls. The wagon was garish even compared to the others in the show, a red and blue thing that shone like the finest lacquer work, every surface spotted with golden comets and stars. The phases of the moon, in silver, ran all the way around, just below the roofline. Even the tin chimney was painted in red and blue rings. A tinker would have blushed. To one side of the wagon, 2 ranks of helmeted Shan soldiers stood stiffly beside their horses. Green tasseled lances slanted at exactly the same angle. One of the men held the reins of an extra mount, a fine dun gelding with strong haunches and good ankles. The soldier's blue and green armor appeared drab alongside Luca's wagon. I was unsurprised to see he was not the only one interested in the Shan. A dark stocking cap covering his shaved head, Bale Doman was squatting on his heels with his back against one wheel of the green wagon that belonged to Petra and Clarine, about 30 paces beyond the soldiers. Clarine's dogs lay under the wagon, a motley collection of smallish animals sleeping huddled together. The thick-bodied Ileana was pretending to whittle, but all he had produced was a small pile of shavings at his feet. Matt wished the fellow would grow a mustache to hide his upper lip, or else shave off the rest of his beard. Someone might connect an Ileana to a Guinan. Blarick Najina, a tall fellow leaning against the wagon as though keeping Doman company, had not hesitated to remove his Shinaran topknot to avoid Shanshan notice, though he ran a hand over the black bristle growing on his head about as often as a Guinan checked her wig. Maybe he should wear a cap. Their dark coats, with frayed cuffs and well-traveled boots, both men could pass for showfolk, maybe horse handlers, except to other showfolk. They were watching the Shanshan while trying to seem not to, but Blarick was the more successful, as might be expected from a warder. His full attention appeared to be on Doman, except for an occasional glance at the soldiers, as casual as could be. Doman scowled at the Shanshan when he was not glaring at the lump of wood in his hand, as though ordering it to turn into a neat carving. The man had taken being Sojin entirely too much to heart. Matt was trying to figure out how to sneak close to Luca's wagon and eavesdrop unseen by the soldiers when the door at the back of the wagon opened, and a pale-haired Shanshan marched down the steps, planting a helmet with a thin blue plume on his head as his boot touched the ground. Luca appeared behind him, resplendent in scarlet embroidered with golden sunbursts, bowing with elaborate flourishes as he followed the officer. Luca owned at least 24 coats, most red and each gaudier than the last. It was a good thing his wagon was the largest in the show, or he would not have had room for them all. Ignoring Luca, the Shanshan officer stepped up onto his gelding, adjusted his sword, and barked orders that sent his men flowing into their saddles and forming a column of 2s that moved off at a slow walk toward the entrance. Luca stood watching them leave with a fixed smile on his face, poised for another bow if any looked back. He stayed well to the side of the street and let his mouth hang open, affecting to gape in wonder as the soldiers rode by. Not that any of them so much as glanced his way. The officer stared straight ahead, and so did the soldiers behind him. But no one ever paid any mind to a country yokel, or remembered one. To his surprise, a Guinan studied the ground in front of her toes, clutching the scarf knotted beneath her chin until the last horseman passed. Lifting her head to look after them, she searched for a moment. "It seems I do know that boy," she drawled softly. "I carried him to Falma on Fearless. His servant died mid-voyage, and he thought he could use one of my crew. I had to put him straight. You'd have thought he was of the blood, the fuss he put up." "Blood and bloody ashes," Matt breathed. How many other people had she gotten crosswise, fixing her face in their minds? A Guinan being a Guinan, probably hundreds. And he had been letting her walk around with just a wig and a change of clothes for disguise. Hundreds? Thousands, more likely. She could irritate a brick. In any case, the officer was gone now. Matt exhaled slowly. His luck really was still with him. At times he thought that was all that kept him from bawling like a baby. He headed for Luca to find out what the soldiers had wanted. Doman and Blarick reached as quickly as he and Guinan, and the scowl on Doman's round face deepened as he stared at Matt's arm around Guinan's shoulder. The Ilianer understood the necessity for the pretense, or said he did, yet he seemed to believe they could carry it off without so much as touching hands. Matt removed his arm from her. There was nothing to carry off here. Luca knew the truth, of everything, and the Guinan started to release him too, yet after a look at Doman, she tightened her grip on Matt's waist instead, all without the slightest change of expression. Doman continued to scowl, but at the ground now. Matt decided he would understand the Shanshan long before he understood women, or Ilianers for that matter. "Horses," Luca growled almost before Matt stopped walking. His frown took in all of them, but he focused most of his anger on Matt. A little bit taller, Lucas stretched down to stare at Matt.
That's what he wanted. I showed him the warrant exempting me from the horse lottery, signed by the High Lady Soreth herself. But was he impressed? It didn't matter to him that I rescued a high-ranking Shang-Chan.
The woman had not been high-ranking, and he had not so much rescued her as given her a way to travel as a hired performer. But Luca always exaggerated to his own advantage.
Don't know how long that exemption is really good for anyway. The Shang-Chan are desperate for horses. They might take it back any day.
His face was turning almost as red as his coat, and he jabbed a finger at Matt repeatedly.
You're going to get my horses taken. How do I move my show with no horses? Answer me that if you can. I was ready to leave as soon as I saw that madness in the harbor, until you twisted my arm. You're going to get my head cut off. I could be 100 miles from here, if not for you riding in out of the night and snaring me in your crazy schemes.
I'll be right back.
I'm not earning a penny here. There haven't been enough patrons the last 3 days to pay for feeding the animals one day. Half the day. I should have left a month ago. More, I should have.
Matt almost laughed as Luca ran down into splutters. Horses. That was all. Just horses. Besides, the notion that the show's heavy-laden wagons could cover 100 miles in 5 days was as ludicrous as Luca's wagon. The man could have gone a month ago, 2 months, except for wanting to eke every copper he could out of Abu Dar and its Shang-Chan conquerors. And as for talking him into staying 6 nights past, that had been as easy as falling out of bed. Instead of laughing, Matt put a hand on Luca's shoulder. The fellow was vain as a peacock and greedy besides, but there was no point making him angrier than he already was. If you'd left that night, Luca, do you think nobody would have gotten suspicious? You would have had Shang-Chan tearing your wagons apart before you made 2 leagues. You could say I saved you from that. Luca glowered. Some people just could not see beyond their own noses. Anyway, you can stop worrying. As soon as Tom returns from the city, we can put as many miles behind us as you want. Luca leaped so suddenly that Matt stepped back in alarm, but all the man did was caper in a little circle, laughing. Doman goggled at him, and even Blerick stared. Sometimes Luca seemed a flat bull-goose fool. Luca had barely begun his dance when Aginin shoved Matt away from her. As soon as Marilyn returns. I gave orders no one was to leave. Her glare swung between him and Luca in cold fury, a cold that burned. I expect my orders to be obeyed. Luca stopped cavorting abruptly and eyed her sideways, then suddenly made her a bow with so many flourishes you could practically see the cloak. You could almost see the embroidery on the cloak. He thought he had a way with women, Luca did.
You command, my sweet lady, and I leap to obey.
Coming upright, he shrugged apologetically.
But Master Cawthon has gold, and I fear gold commands my first obedience.
Matt's chest full of gold coins in this very wagon had been all the arm-twisting needed to convince him. Maybe Matt being Taviran had helped, but born of gold, Val Luca would help kidnap the Dark One. Aginin drew a deep breath, ready to berate Luca further, but the man turned his back and went scampering up the steps into his wagon, shouting,
Littell! Littell! We must roust everybody out immediately. We're leaving at last. The minute Marilyn returns, the light be praised.
A moment later, he was back again, dashing back down the short stair, followed by his wife, drawing a black velvet cloak sewn with glittering spangles around herself. A stern-faced woman, she wrinkled her nose at Matt as though he had a bad smell, and gave Aginin a look that likely made her trained bears climb trees. Littell disliked the idea of a woman running away from her husband, even when she knew it was a lie. Luckily, she seemed to worship Luca for some reason, and she liked gold nearly as well as he did. Luca ran to the nearest wagon and began pounding on the door, and Littell did the same at the next. Waiting around to watch, Matt hurried off down one of the side streets. More of an alley compared to the main street. It wound around the same sort of wagons and tents, all shut up tight against the cold, with smoke streaming from the metal chimneys. There were no platforms for performers here, but lines for drying laundry hung between some of the wagons, and here and there wooden toys lay scattered on the ground. This street was for living only, the narrowness meant to discourage outsiders. He moved quickly despite his hip. He had walked most of the ache out, but he had not gone 10 steps before Aginin and Doman caught up to him. Blerick had vanished, probably gone to tell the sisters they were still safe and could finally leave. The Aes Sedai, masquerading as servants, sick with worry that their mistress's husband would catch them, were fed up with being confined to their wagon, not to mention fed up with sharing with the Suldam. Matt had made them share, so the Aes Sedai could watch the Suldam, while the Suldam kept the Aes Sedai out of his hair. Still, Matt was glad Blerick had taken away the necessity for him to visit that wagon again. One or another of the sisters had summoned him 4 or 5 times a day since their escape from the city, and he went when he could not avoid it, but it was never a pleasant experience. Keenan did not put her arm around him this time. She strode at his side, staring straight ahead, not bothering to check her wig for once. Doman lumbered behind like a bear, muttering under his breath in his heavy Illianer accent. The stocking cap exposed the fact that his dark beard stopped abruptly at the middle of each ear, with only stubble above. It made him look unfinished. 2 captains on 1 ship. Make sure course for disaster, Egina drawled with overdone patience. Her understanding smile looked as if it hurt her face. We aren't on a ship, Matt replied. The principle's the same, Coffin. You are a farmer. I know you're a good man in a tight spot. Egina shot a dark look over her shoulder at Doman. He was the one who had brought her and Matt together. She was getting a hired man. But this situation needs judgment and experience. We're in dangerous waters, and you have no knowledge of command. More than you might think, he told her dryly. He could have spun out a list of the battles he remembered commanding, but only an historian would recognize most of them, and maybe not even an historian. No one would believe it anyway. He certainly would not, if someone else had made that claim. Wouldn't you and Doman be getting ready? You wouldn't want to leave anything behind. Everything she owned was already stowed away in the wagon she and Max shared with Doman. Not a comfortable arrangement, that. But he quickened his step, hoping she would take the hint. Besides, he saw his destination ahead. The bright blue wall tent, crowded between a virulent yellow wagon and an emerald green one, was barely large enough to hold 3 cots, but providing shelter for everyone he brought out of Ebu Dar had required bribes to make people move, and more bribes to make others let them in. What he had been able to hire was what the owners were willing to let him have, at rates suitable for a good inn. Julian, a dark, compact man with short black hair, was sitting on the ground in front of the tent with Oliver, a thin little boy, if not so skinny as when Matt first saw him, and short for 10, the age he claimed. Both coatless despite the wind, they were playing snakes and foxes on a board the boy's dead father had drawn for him on a piece of red cloth. Tossing the dice, Oliver counted the pips carefully and considered his move along the spiderweb of black lines and arrows. The Tyrant thief-catcher was paying less attention to the game. He sat up straight at the sight of Matt. Abruptly, Noel darted around from the rear of the tent, breathing hard as if he had been running. Julian glanced up in surprise at the old man, and Matt frowned. He had told Noel to come straight here. Where had he gone instead? Noel looked at him expectantly, not with any guilt or embarrassment, just eager to hear what Matt had to say. "You know about the Shongshan?" Julian asked, turning his attention to Matt, too. A shadow moved inside the tent's entry flaps, and a dark-haired woman, seated on the end of one of the cots with an old gray cloak wrapped around her, leaned forward to rest a hand on Julian's arm, and to give Matt a wary look. Her was pretty, if you liked a mouth that always seemed to be pouting, and it seemed that Julian did, from the way he smiled at her reassuringly and patted her hand. She was also Amathera Elfdine Casimir Luneau, Panarch of Terabon, and the next thing to a queen. At least she had been once. Julian had known that, and so had Tom, yet no one thought to tell Matt until they reached the show. He supposed it hardly mattered, alongside everything else. She answered faster to Thera than to Amathera. She made no demands, except on Julian's time, and there seemed little chance anyone would recognize her here. In any case, Matt hoped she felt more than gratitude for being rescued, because Julian certainly felt more for her. Who was to say a dethroned Panarch could not fall in love with a thief-catcher? Stranger things had happened, though he was not sure he could name one offhand. They just wanted to see the warrant for Lucas' horse, he said, and Julian nodded, visibly relaxing a little. Well, they didn't count the horse lines. The warrant listed the exact number of horses Luca was allowed to keep. The Shongshan could be generous with their rewards, but given their need for mounts and wagon teams, they were not about to hand anyone a license to set up horse trading. At best, they would have taken the extra. At worst, the thief-catcher shrugged. Another cheerful soul. With a gasp, Thera suddenly pulled her cloak tighter and jerked back into the depths of the tent. Julian looked behind Matt, his eyes going hard, and the tyrant could match the waters when it came to hard. Guinan did not seem to catch hints, and she was glaring at the tent. Doman stood beside her with his arms folded, sucking his teeth in thought or forced patience. "Is your tent packed up, Sandar?" Aegean ordered. "The show is leaving as soon as Marilyn returns." Her jaw tightened, and she did not quite glare at Matt. Not quite. "Make sure your woman doesn't give any trouble." Most lately, Thera had been a servant, Dakovale, the property of the High Lady Suroth, until Julian stole her away. To Aegean, stealing Dakovale was almost as bad as freeing Damani. "Can I ride Wind?" Oliver exclaimed, bounding to his feet. "Can I, Matt? Can I, Lawin?" Aegean actually smiled at him. Matt had yet to see her smile at anyone else, even Doman. "Not yet," Matt said. Not until they were far enough from Abu Dar that no one was likely to remember the Grey winning races with a small boy on his back. "Few days, maybe. Julian, will you tell the others? Blarick already knows, so the sisters are taken care of." Julian did not waste time, aside from ducking inside the tent to reassure Thera. She seemed to need reassuring frequently. When he came out, carrying a dark tie-in coat that was beginning to show wear, he told Oliver to put the game away and help Thera with the packing until he returned, then settled his flat-topped, conical red hat on his head and started off, shrugging into the coat. He never so much as glanced at Aegean. She considered him a thief, offensive in itself to a thief-catcher, and the tyrant had no love for her either. Matt started to ask Noel where he had been, but the old man darted nimbly after Julian, calling over his shoulder that he would help let the others know the show was leaving. Well, two could spread the word faster than one. Vannon and the four surviving Red Arms shared a crowded tent on one side of the show, while Noel himself shared another with Tom and the two serving men, Lopin and Merrim, on the opposite side. And the question could wait. Probably he had just delayed to put his precious fish somewhere safe. In any case, the question suddenly seemed unimportant. Noise of people shouting for horse handlers to bring their teams, and others demanding at the top of their lungs to know what was happening, was beginning to fill the camp. Adria, a slim woman holding a flowered green robe around her, came running up in bare feet and vanished into the yellow wagon where the other four contortionists lived. Somebody in the green wagon bellowed hoarsely that people were trying to sleep. A handful of performers' children, some performers themselves, dashed by, and Oliver looked up from folding the game. That was his most prized possession, but if not for that, he plainly would have gone after them. It was going to take some time yet before the show was ready to travel, but that was not what made Matt groan. He had just heard those bloody dice start rattling in his head again. Chapter 3. A Fan of Colors. Did not know whether to curse or weep. With the soldiers gone and Abu Dar about to be left in his dust, there seemed no reason for the dice, but there never was a bloody reason he could see until it was too late. Whatever was coming might lie days in the future or only an hour, but he had never been able to figure it out ahead of time. The only certainties were that something important, or dire, was going to happen, and that he would not be able to avoid it. Sometimes, like that night at the gate, he did not understand why the dice had been tumbling, even after they stopped. All he really knew for sure was that however much the dice made him twitch like a goat with the itch, once they started, he did not want them to stop ever. But they did. Sooner or later, they always did. "You all right, Matt?" Oliver said. "The Shanshan can't catch us." He attempted gruff conviction, but a hint of question hung in his voice. Abruptly, Matt realized he had been staring at nothing. Aegean frowned at him while fiddling absent-mindedly with her wig, plainly angry that he was ignoring her. Doman's eyes had a studious look. If he was not deciding whether to be upset on Aegean's behalf, Matt would eat his cap. Even Thera was peeking at him past the tent's entry flap, and she always tried to keep out of Aegean's sight. He could not explain. Only a man with porridge for brains would believe he got warnings from hearing dice no one could see. Or maybe a man marked by the power. Or by the Dark One. He was not anxious to have any of those things suspected of him. and it might be that night at the gate all over again. No, this was not a secret he cared to reveal. It would do no good anyway. Never catch us, Oliver. Not you and me. He ruffled the boy's hair, and Oliver gave a wide-mouthed grin, confidence restored as easy as that. So long as we keep our eyes open and our wits about us. Remember, you can find a way out of any difficulty if you keep your eyes and wits sharp. But if you don't, you'll trip over your own feet. Oliver nodded gravely, but Matt meant the reminder for the others. Or maybe himself. Like there was no way any of them could be more alert. Except for Oliver, who thought it was all a great adventure. They had all been jumping out of their skins since before leaving the city. Go help Thera, like Julian told you, Oliver. A sharp gust cut through Matt's coat, making him shiver. And put your coat on. It's cold, he added as the boy ducked past Thera into the tent. Rustles and scraping sounds from inside said that Oliver was setting to work, with or without his coat, but Thera remained crouched at the tent's entrance, peering at Matt. For all the care anybody but Matt Cawthon took, the boy could catch his death. As soon as Oliver disappeared, Egina stepped closer to Matt, her fists on her hips again, and he groaned under his breath. We are going to settle matters now, Cawthon, she said in a hard voice. Now. I won't have our journey wrecked by you countermanding my orders. There's nothing to settle, he told her. I was never your hired hand, and that's that. Somehow her face managed to grow harder, as good as shouting that she did not see matters like that. The woman was as tenacious as a snapping turtle, but there had to be some way to pry her jaws from his leg, burn him if he wanted to be alone with the dice rolling in his head, yet that was better than having to listen to them while arguing with her. I'm going to see Tuan before we leave. The words popped out of his mouth before they were clear in his head. He realized that they had been lying there for some time, though, murky and slowly solidifying. The blood drained from Eginan's cheeks as soon as Tuan's name left his mouth, and he heard a squeak from Thera, followed by the snap of the tent flaps being jerked shut. One time Panarch had absorbed a great many Shonchan ways while she was Suroth's property, and many of their taboos as well. Eginan was made of harder stuff, however. Why? She demanded. In almost the same breath she went on, anxious and furious all at once. You mustn't call her that. You must show respect. Harder in some ways. Matt grinned, but she did not seem to see the joke. Respect. There was precious little respect in stuffing a gag in someone's mouth and rolling them up in a wall hanging. Calling Tuan High Lady or anything else was not going to change that. Of course, Eginan was more willing to talk about freeing Damani than she was about Tuan. If she could have pretended the kidnapping never happened, she would have, and as it was, she tried. Like she had tried to ignore it while it was happening. In her mind, any other crimes she might have committed paled to nothing beside that. Because I want to talk with her, he said. And why not? He had to sooner or later. People had begun trotting up and down the narrow street now, half-dressed men with their shirts hanging out, and women with their hair still wrapped in nightkerchiefs, some leading horses and others just milling about as far as he could make out. A wiry boy a little bigger than Oliver went past doing handsprings wherever the crowd gave him a pace of room, practicing or maybe playing. The sleepy fellow in the deep green wagon still had not appeared. Luca's grand traveling show would not be traveling anywhere for hours yet. There was plenty of time. You could come with me, he suggested in his most innocent voice. He should have thought of this before. The invitation made Eginan go fence post stiff for true. It hardly seemed possible her face could grow any paler, but an extra scrap of color leached out. You will show her fitting respect, she said hoarsely, clutching the knotted scarf with both hands as though trying to squeeze the black wig tighter onto her head. Belle, I want to make sure my things are stowed properly. The woman hesitated as she turned and hurried away into the crowd without looking back, and Matt watched him warily. He had vague memories of a flight on Doman's river ship once, but vague was the best he could say of them. Tom was friendly with Doman, a point in the Ilianer's favor, yet he was Eginan's man to the knife, ready to back her on anything down to disliking Julian, and Matt trusted him no further than he did her, which was to say, not very far. Eginan and Doman had their own goals, and whether Matt Cawthon kept a whole hide did not factor in them. He doubted that the man really trusted him, for that matter, but then neither of them had much choice at the moment. Fortune pricked me, Doman muttered, scratching the bristles growing above his left ear. Whatever you do be up to, you may be in over your head. I think she do be tougher than you do suspect. Eginin, Matt said incredulously. He looked around quickly to see whether anyone in the alley had heard his slip. A few glanced at him and Doman as they brushed by, but nobody glanced twice. Luca was not the only one eager to be gone from a city where the flow of patrons for the show had dried up, and night lightning setting the harbor on fire was a fresh memory. They might all have fled that first night, leaving Matt nowhere to hide, except for Luca arguing them out of it. That promised gold made Luca very persuasive. Well, she's tougher than old boots, Doman, but old boots don't count with me. This isn't a bloody show, and I'm not letting her take charge and ruin everything. Doman grimaced as if Matt were goose-brained. The girl, man. Do you believe you can be so calm if you did be carried off in the night? Whatever you be playing at with that wild talk of her being your wife, have a care or she may shave your head at the shoulders. I was just cutting the fool, Matt muttered. How many times do I have to say it? I was unnerved for a minute. Oh, he had been that. Learning who Tuan was, while he was wrestling with her, would have unnerved a bloody Trolloc. Doman grunted in disbelief. Well, it was hardly the best story Matt had ever come up with. Except for Doman, everyone who had heard him babbling seemed to accept the tale, though. Matt thought they had, anyway. Eginin might get a knot in her tongue at the very thought of Tuan, but she would have said plenty if she believed he had been serious. Likely she would have put her knife in him. Peering in the direction Eginin had gone, Iliana shook his head. Try to keep a grip on your tongue from now on. Lyle win. Do near have a fit whenever she do think about what you did say. Heard her muttering under her breath, and you can wager the girl herself does take it no lighter. You cut the fool with her, and you may get us all shortened. He slid a finger across his throat expressively and gave a curt nod before pushing through the crowd after Eginin. Watching him go, Matt shook his own head. Tuan tough. True, she was the daughter of the Nine Moons and all of that, and she had been able to get under his skin with a look back in the Terracent Palace, when he thought she was just another Shan noblewoman with her nose in the air, but that was just because she kept turning up where he did not expect. No more than that. Tough? She looked like a doll made of black porcelain. How tough could she be? It was all you could do to keep her from breaking your nose, and maybe more, he reminded himself. Been careful not to repeat what Doman called wild talk, but the truth of it was, he was going to marry Tuan. The thought made him sigh. He knew it as sure as prophecy, which it was, in a way. He could not imagine how such a marriage could come about. It seemed impossible on the face of it, and he would not weep if that proved to be so. But he knew it would not. Why did he always find himself bloody lumbered with bloody women who pulled knives on him or tried to kick his head off? It was not fair. He intended to go straight to the wagon where Tuan and Selucia were being kept, with Satala Anand to watch. The innkeeper could make a stone seem soft. A pampered noblewoman and a lady's maid would give her no trouble, especially with a red arm on duty outside. At least, they had not so far, or he would have heard. He found his feet wandering, taking him along the winding streets that ran through the show. Bustle filled all of them, wide and narrow alike. Men rushed by leading horses that frisked and shied, too long without exercise. Other people were taking down tents and packing the storage wagons, or hauling cloth-wrapped bundles or brass-bound chests and casks and canisters of every size out of the house-like wagons that had been standing here for months, partially unloading so everything could be repacked for travel, even while the teams were being harnessed. The din was constant. Horses whickered, women shouted for children. Children cried over lost toys or yelled for the pure pleasure of noise. Men bellowed to know who had been at their harness or who had borrowed some tool. A troop of acrobats, slender but muscular women, who worked on ropes dangling from tall poles, had surrounded one of the horse handlers, all of them waving their arms and giving voice at the top of their lungs, and nobody listening. Matt paused a moment trying to figure out what they were arguing over, but eventually he decided they were not sure themselves. Two fighting coatless men rolled on the ground, watched closely by the likely cause, a willowy, hot-eyed seamstress named Germaine, but Petra appeared, and pulled them apart before Matt could even get a bet down. He was not afraid of seeing Tuan again. Of course not. He had stayed away after sticking her into that wagon to give her time to settle down and collect herself. That was all. Only calm, Dillman had called her, and it was true. Snapped in the middle of the night, snatched out into a storm by people who would as soon have cut her throat as look at her, as far as she knew, and she had been by far the coolest of them all. Light she could have planted herself. That was how upset she was. It made him feel as if the point of a knife were tickling between his shoulder blades then, and the knife was back again just thinking about her. And those dice were rattling away inside his skull. The woman's hardly likely to exchange vows here and now, he thought with a chuckle, but it sounded forced even to him. Yet there was no reason under the sun for him to be afraid. He was just properly wary, not afraid. Joe might have equaled a fair-sized village for size, but there was only so long a man could wander about in that much space before he started doubling back on himself. Soon enough, too soon, he found himself staring at a windowless wagon painted in faded purple, surrounded by canvas-topped storage wagons, and in sight of the southernmost horse lines. The dung carts had not gone out this morning, and the odor was strong. The wind carried a heavy scent from the nearest animal cages, too, a musky smell of big cats and bears, and light knew what else. Beyond the storage wagons and pickets, a section of the canvas wall fell, and another began to shake as men loosened the guy ropes holding the poles. The sun, half hidden by dark clouds now, had climbed halfway to its noonday peak or better, but it was still too soon. Harnan and Metwin, two of the Red Arms, had already hitched the first pair of horses to the shaft of the purple wagon, and were almost done with the second pair. Soldiers well trained in the band of the Red Hand, they would be ready to take the road, while the showfolk were still figuring out which way the horses were supposed to face. Matt had taught the band to move fast when there was need. His own feet dragged as though he were wading in mud. Vernon, with that fool tattoo of a hawk on his cheek, was the first to see him. Buckling a trace, the heavy-jawed file leader exchanged looks with Metwin, a boyish-faced Kyrianan whose appearance belied his age and his weakness for tavern brawls. They had no call to look surprised. "Everything going smoothly? I want to be away in good time." Rubbing his hands together against the cold, Matt eyed the purple wagon uneasily. He should have brought her a present, jewelry or flowers. Either worked as well with most women. "Smooth enough, my lord," Harnan replied in a cautious tone. "No shouting, no screaming, no crying." He glanced at the wagon as if he did not credit it himself. "Quiet suits me," Metwin said, stringing one of the reins through a ring on a horse collar. "Woman starts crying, the only thing to do is leave if you value your hide. And we can hardly drop these off by the side of the road." But he glanced at the wagon, too, and shook his head in disbelief. There really was nothing for Matt to do except go inside. So he did. It only took 2 tries, with a smile fixed on his face, to make himself climb the short flight of painted wood steps at the back of the wagon. He was not afraid, but any fool would know enough to be nervous. Despite the lack of windows, the interior of the wagon was well lighted, with 4 mirrored lamps burning, and the lamps held good oil, so there was no rancid smell. But then, with the stink from outside, it would have been hard to tell. He needed to find a better spot to park his wagon. A small brick stove with an iron door and an iron top for cooking made the space toasty compared with outside. It was not a large wagon, and every inch of wall that could be spared was covered with cabinets or shelves or pegs for hanging clothing and towels and the like. But the table that could be let down on ropes was snug against the ceiling, and the 3 women inside the wagon were hardly crowded. Could not have been more different, those 3. Mistress Annan was sitting on one of the 2 narrow beds built into the walls, a regal woman with touches of gray in her hair, seemingly intent on her embroidery hoop and not looking at all as if she were a guard. A large golden ring hung on each of her ears, and her marriage knife dangled from a close-fitting silver necklace, the hilt with its red and white stones snug in the cleavage exposed by the narrow plunging neckline of her Abudari dress that had one side of the skirt sewn up to expose yellow petticoats. She wore another knife with a long curved blade tucked behind her belt, but that was just the custom of Abu Dar. Satala had refused to take on any disguise, which seemed well enough. No one had reason to be hunting for her, and finding clothes for everyone else had been a big enough problem as it was. Selucia, a pretty woman with skin the color of buttery cream, was cross-legged on the floor between the beds, a dark scarf covering her shaven head and a sullen expression on her face. though normally she was dignified enough to make Mistress Annan look flighty. Her eyes were as blue as Eginen's and more piercing, and she had made more fuss than Eginen over losing the rest of her hair. She disliked the dark blue Ebidari dress she had been given, too, claiming the deep neckline was indecent, but it hid her as effectively as a mask. Few men who glimpsed Selucia's impressive bosom would be able to focus long on her face. He might have enjoyed the view for a moment or two himself, but there was Tuon, seated on the wagon's only stool, a leather-bound book open on her lap, and he could barely make himself look at anything else. His wife-to-be. Light. Tuon was tiny, not just short, but almost slim as a boy, and a loose-fitting dress of brown wool, bought from one of the showfolk, made her seem a child wearing her